welcome back to another video. Today we'll be doing ecological studies, part 1 of a part 2 lesson. So some definitions to know. Ecology is simply the study of living organisms in their environment. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms sharing an environment. So when we're looking at the environment, we look at the abiotic or the non-living chemical and physical factors and the biotic, meaning living factors. When we're looking at abiotic, we can group them into climatic, meaning related to temperature, rainfall, humidity, meaning the amount of moisture in the air, wind, light. We can look at edaphic factors, which are soil-related factors, aquatic, meaning water-related, and physiographic, meaning the physical features of the earth. And when we're looking at biotic factors, we look at other organisms. We look at competition, if there is a prey and a predator relationship, symbiosis, and disease agents. Some of these which we will further discuss in detail. A habitat is simply the place where a particular organism lives. So, for humans, most live in a house or an apartment or a townhouse. And you can look at based on country, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados. So, it's the same thing for other living organisms. For example, a rainforest is a type of habitat where parrots, monkeys, snakes may reside. Marine, that has to do with oceans and seas. So dolphins live in the ocean. A niche is simply the role of an organism in an ecosystem. So let's look at this image here. And we can look at the different roles of the various types of birds. This bird feeds in the middle part of the tree, while this bird feeds at the tips of branches near the top of the tree. So the niche of an organism really speaks to how they contribute to the working and the functioning of the ecosystem. Species is a group of individuals that resemble one another and are normally capable of producing fertile offspring. They tend to share the same common ancestry. A population of a species simply refers to the members of that particular species living in a particular habitat. Community. A community is simply all the populations of different species found living in a particular habitat. So if we were supposed to look at the community of Mona, which is in Kingston and St. Andrew, we can see that there are different persons living in that community that may be unrelated to one another, but because they're found within that same area, they represent a community. Organisms within an ecosystem are linked to show food chains based on their different methods of obtaining organic food. So when you're looking at food chains, you want to look at the trophic levels, which signify feeding levels. At the start of the food chain, you have to remember that sunlight is the ultimate energy for all life on Earth, but only the producers can get their energy directly from the sun. So, the first trophic level is always a producer, or sometimes we refer to them as the primary producer. These are green plants. They make their own food through photosynthesis. For example, algae, as we said, green plants, and some bacteria actually. The energy is stored into their organic food molecules and are passed on through food chains. At each link in the food chain, energy and biomass is lost. example through defecation, excretion, used in respiration. And since there's less energy and biomass at each successive trophic level, there are fewer at each level as you move up the chain. So due to this loss of energy and biomass, food chains rarely exceed 5 organisms. You may have herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores in the food chain. Herbivores feed only on plants, carnivores feed only on animals, and omnivores feed on plants and animals. Please note that decomposers do not form food chains, and I'll explain later on. So we can actually use energy pyramids to represent the number of organisms, the energy, and the biomass at each level in a food chain. So we call this a pyramid, almost like the Pyramid of Egypt. You see, it's very triangular. Now, as we said, always begin with the producers absorbing sunlight. The producers store energy in the chemical bonds of the food they make, and the stored energy is passed to the consumers when they eat. Now, we already said that as you go up the food chain, you lose biomass and energy, and you therefore tend to have less organisms as you go up. And you can see this very clearly in the energy pyramid, that as you move up, there becomes less organisms in each trophic level. So we're going to look at some examples of food chains. This is a terrestrial food chain on the left, meaning a food chain on land. And this is an aquatic food chain, meaning a food chain in a water body. At the bottom of the food chain, you can see that there is grass, which is the primary producer. The grasshoppers feed on the grass, and so they are called the primary consumer. It's important to note that the grasshopper is a herbivore because it feeds on grass, it feeds on plants. The praying mantis feeds on the grasshopper, so they are the secondary consumer. The lizard feeds on the praying mantis, so they're the tertiary consumer. And the hawk feeds on the lizard, so they are the quaternary consumer. The praying mantis, the lizard, and the hawk are all carnivores because they feed on other animals. So let's look over here at the aquatic food chain. We have what we call phytoplankton, which is a type of producer or a green plant. The zooplankton feeds on the phytoplankton. The flying fish feeds on the zooplankton, and the barracuda fish feeds on the flying fish. And lastly, the shark, which is the quaternary consumer, feeds on the barracuda fish. Just to recap, herbivores eat plants only. Omnivores eat plants and animals, and carnivores eat animals only. So when we're looking at food webs, we're actually looking at multiple food chains. Most organisms have more than one food source, just like you and I. Most of us eat chicken or fish or pork or beef. And so the food webs really show how the different food chains interrelate to one another. As you can see, let's use this diagram over here. We see that the butterfly feeds on the grass, and the grouse feeds on the butterfly, and the grouse is fed on by the red-tailed hawk. But the red-tailed hawk also feeds on the chipmunk, and the chipmunk also feeds on seeds. And the grizzly bear feeds on the chipmunk, also feeds on berries and flowers, and also feeds on the deer. So we already know that the grizzly bear is an omnivore because it feeds on animals and it also feeds on plants. Let's look over here. We see that the grasshopper feeds on the snail and the snail feeds on the grass. We also see that the owl feeds on the sparrow. The sparrow feeds on the grass as well. So you see, many of the organisms have multiple food sources. And it's important that we understand how food webs work because it allows us to predict population size and other characteristics within the ecosystem. So now we're going to talk about decomposers. If you recall, we crossed out the decomposer on the food chain because a food chain with decomposers form food cycles, and we were only focused on the food chain. So there is actually a role for decomposers, which are fungi and bacteria, in that they convert the complex compounds to simple substances. It's important to note that energy is not recycled. Energy flows from producers to consumers to decomposers in one direction. The substances can be used by living organisms, and other substances like nitrogen, carbon released from the bodies of dead organisms by decomposers are continuously recycled. Which is the secondary consumer in this food chain? We have the grass, to the grasshopper, to the frog, to the hawk. So which one of these is the secondary consumer? So if you said the frogs, you'd absolutely be correct. Remember, the grass, which is a green plant, is always going to be the primary producer or the producer in the food chain. The grasshopper is the primary consumer. So remember, the primary consumes the primary producer. And then the secondary consumer is what will consume the primary consumer. The tertiary consumer is what will consume the secondary consumer. What is wrong with this pyramid of numbers over here? Is it A, the hawks don't eat thrushes? The clover should be at the bottom. Snails don't eat clover. The answer is the clover should be at the bottom because the clover is the producer. So remember, the green plants, for example, clovers, they always start the food chain. So they should really be at the bottom. And as you can see, the hawk does feed on the thrush. So we know A is wrong. It says snails don't eat clover. That's wrong because we know that the snail would be the one to eat the clover. What is likely to happen to the population of slugs if the population of thrushes decreases? Will the population of slugs increase, decrease, or stay the same? If you said it will increase, you are correct. So if the population of thrushes decreases, meaning there are less thrushes in the ecosystem, then the population of slugs would increase. This is because the slugs would have fewer predators. So there would be fewer thrushes feeding on the slugs, so there would be more slugs surviving. What is likely to happen to the population of thrushes if the population of voles increases? Will the population of thrushes increase, decrease, or stay the same? It will decrease. If you look closely on the food chain, you will see that the voles and the thrushes both feed on slugs and insects. So they feed on the same organisms. So if the population of voles increase, meaning there are more voles in the ecosystem, then the population of thrushes would decrease because there would be more competition for food. What is likely to happen to the population of foxes if the population of rabbits decreases? Will it increase, decrease, or stay the same? It will decrease. So if the population of rabbits decreases, the population of foxes will decrease too. Because as you can see, foxes, they consume the rabbits. So if there are less rabbits available for food, then you'll find that more foxes will not be surviving and they will die. What do the arrows in a food chain show? Is it how many organisms are present, what eats what, or the transfer of energy? You are correct if you said C, the transfer of energy. So we are seeing in food chains how the energy is transferred throughout the various trophic levels. So the energy stored up in the grass is transferred to the rabbit, the insect, and the slug. The energy stored in the rabbit is transferred to the fox. What can we conclude from this pyramid of numbers? The producer must be very large. The producer must be very small. The primary consumer must be a carnivore. So A is correct. Now we know that normally the larger number of organisms will be found at the bottom where the producers are. So if we see a pyramid of numbers like this, that's able to supply energy to so many consumers, then the producer itself must be very large in size. So we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about size. For example, a very large tree can provide energy for the primary consumers. So even though it's just one single tree, it can provide for say 5 different birds. So share this video with a classmate or a friend if you found that it was helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to Minty, and I'll see you in the next lesson.